Once again, it's Peter who gets the scene rolling in the gospel passage we read this morning. And frankly, if you recall my past remarks about Peter from this pulpit, he is the disciple that frustrates me the most. He's impetuous, tactless, and a zealous follower of Jesus who insists on filling the space and has a hard time understanding things Jesus says. Peter tries my patience. And in this morning's gospel, it's the same thing. Peter, feeling all self-assured and magnanimous and everything, asks Jesus, now, Jesus, just exactly how many times do I have to forgive somebody? Sounds to me like Peter's got a rock in his craw. So he asks Jesus for a specific number of times he needs to forgive somebody for something. Is it 7? Peter asks. Because that would make some sense. And in Hebrew numerology, 7 is the number symbolizing perfection. And you know Peter's keeping score about the folks who have wronged him. There's a running tally going in Peter's mind. And Peter needs a concrete and absolute answer for how many times he has to be the bigger man. 7 times? Asks Peter of Jesus. Gosh, that's hard, but if you say so, Jesus, but on the 8th time, game's over. Peter just wants an answer. Peter wants a tidy, transactional answer. He wants an answer that's easy to swallow. But Jesus never gives answers that are easy to swallow. Ever. How often have we read this passage and not realized Peter's egoism? How often have we heard Peter's questions and Jesus' answer and not paid attention to Peter's self-orbit? See, what's important is that Peter asks how many times he has to forgive. He does not ask how many times he must be forgiven. Peter maintains his own power position in the question. Peter asks about how many times he must grant forgiveness, maintaining his role as the wronged one again and again, his all-important victim status, and his ability to grant, or not, forgiveness for wrongs done to him. This is Peter's centrism at its best. Don't you do this? I do it. Remembering all the wrongs the world has done to me, keeping score, deciding whether or not, or how often or not, to forgive him or her or that thing or that process or that institution or you name it. Because when I consider Peter's question to Jesus and Jesus' response, I always think of myself as the one granting forgiveness to others, and never the one granted forgiveness. How very different Peter's questions would be if he asked, Lord, how many times must I for my actions be forgiven? But he doesn't ask that, does he? And neither do we, really. It's what we say in the Lord's Prayer every Sunday, some of us every day of the week when we recite the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Or as some say it, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That's an issue with translation from the Greek. Every time we say the prayer, we ask to be forgiven first, and then recognize the parallel of forgiving others who have wronged us. But if you're like me, your life reverses that parallel structure, and you consider all those things that have wronged you and the people that have wronged you before considering all of the wrongs you have done. That's what I do, if I even get to that point at all. Jesus' answer to Peter's questions in the parable reinforces the point, of course, that the slave whose debts are forgiven, hat tip to the Presbyterians there, holds the other slave who owes him money accountable after the ingrate slave's debt forgiveness. Those of us who are forgiven, and that is all of us, are keen yet to keep a balance sheet of those who have wronged us, yet none of us is worthy of holding the tally sheet, Jesus would say, because all of us are the slave who enjoy the king's debt forgiveness program. You might recall my disdain for Peter from the beginning of the homily. But as with most things, we are most deeply annoyed by characteristics in others that only reflect the same flaws in ourselves. Peter's egoism in his question to Jesus about how many times he must forgive others, and his choice not to see himself standing in need of forgiveness first, is my own insistence on keeping score and seeing myself as the one who doles out forgiveness to others, maintaining my own power position instead of realizing my blinding indebtedness that overshadows anyone else's transgressions 7 times 70. Is that you too? Do you, like Peter and me, frame the question of forgiveness in order to keep yourself in the false victim and yet power broker role? What would it be like to approach all our relationships with the understanding that you and I must ask for forgiveness first before we expect anyone else to ask us for it? What would it be like to be forgiven instead of being right? What would it be like to seek forgiveness for ourselves before we approach the question of justice for others? What would it be like to recognize our own utter unworthiness before God and then, only then, realize the overpowering grace of forgiveness for ourselves? Because we are, you and I, forgiven, without question by God who made us and loves us into being, the God who is only love itself. What would it be like to live as forgiven people instead of people who look to grant forgiveness to others? My prayer this week is that you and I, brothers and sisters, approach the world asking for forgiveness first in all that we do. No. Not asking for forgiveness first, simply that you and I approach all that we do asking for forgiveness. Period. Just that. What doors to the kingdom of God might we open if we lived as transformed beings by the willingness to receive grace?